speakers, and then that would allow for some Q&A at the end. So we'll pass the mic around at the end for a question and answer. And most importantly, Carmella brought her books. So please check out the table here. They'll be available for sale after the event. So we're excited she was able to do that for us. I know we just, one more indulgent thank you to Maria Monteskolnik and Jim Baca. They work tirelessly on these events. And this is, I think, the biggest one we've done. So
yes.
Huge gratitude. We were talking about how the Facebook group sort of functions as a hive mind. People will put stuff on Facebook, and 100 other people will say, no, it didn't really happen that way. Grandma was there, or I have a picture. So it's a wonderful tool. I know we always hold our nose about social, and Carmella's not on social media, so she's above the fray. But yeah, please buttonhole Maria or Jim after the event if you have more questions about how the group works, or if you have ideas on how to support our programs. It'd be really meaningful. So I just want to, Carmella's going to be erudite, analytical, breathtaking. I just want to tell one personal little story to start, and then it'll all be her. And what I wanted to tell you was how I met Carmella. And it got me thinking about how we map our memories in Santa Fe. We use odd places that burned down, or places from our childhood. And one of those places for me was the old Santa Fe Trail gift shop. Yeah. So how many people remember Connie Hernandez? Yeah, good. And we had do a little deeper dive. How many people remember Tito's Grocery? Oh my God! Okay, the last one is really going to date me, but does anybody remember Della's Snack Shack in the alley behind Woodgormley? Okay, yay! All our big ones remember. I don't feel quite so old. Anyway, Connie's shop was, it was a landmark, and I was helping out Connie Hernandez one day, and in walks Carmella. I just knew her by reputation and, of course, her amazing books. But I thought, wow, a celebrity does her own shopping. She doesn't send minions out. So sure enough, Carmella wanted to look at Milagros. And that was really fascinating to me, because if you talked about Milagros in New Jersey or Rochester, they just blank, But we know what Milagros stand for and how they're used and the symbolism. And Milagros are scorned in some quarters because they're pot metal, they're scrap metal, they look like throwaway items, but they're precious beyond gold to us, right? She was looking at them. So it made me realize that much of what Carmella has written about has elevated things that we care about in New Mexico that might seem trivial or inconsequential, but they're actually full of profound meaning, and she illuminates grander themes. We have the lowly vegetable. Who would think you could write a whole book about chili? Or those old trashy lowrider cars. Those are chariots of the gods, right? And this, this little family farm on the outskirts of town. Who cares? I look around this room and I see people who donated land for Rancho de las Golondrinas, or they filmed there, or they work as a volunteer. It's a meaningful living museum. So, in a way, for me anyway, Carmella's work is a channel into our ability to keep our history alive. And so for that, I'm extremely grateful. And just one last thing, Carmella, we have all these living historians in here. You know, so if we make a mistake, they're gonna call us out.
Happens all the time.
Okay, so, got through that pretty quickly, I promise myself. Okay, I thought we'd start with your origin story, which, you know, that's another way we map our memories. It's not just, oh, you know, who lived where, it's all the personal stories. And in fact, when we met the other day, we found out Maria Skolnick's grandfather built Carmella's mom's house?
My grandfather's house.
Grandfather's house. And there's a street named after her mom. Thanks to Mr. Martinez, we found that out. So we have this map that may not be moored to what the, you know, so-called scholars tell us is our history or what a map of our town should look like. We have our own internal map of things. And so for us to understand your life, Carmella, can you talk about, very chronologically, starting with your birth and your early years? You want it all.
Well, okay, if I can just say, first of all, I'm really, really so honored to be here. I mean, this is more special to me than a lot of things. My origin story is this. I mean, this is my home. I have cousins here. I have people I went to high school with here. I have people I was in grade school with here. I have people who I've met much later in life, some only recently, and just the warmth and the support of this room is really my origin story, because you can't take the risks that I've taken and sort of gone out and done your thing without the support of a lot of people, and people who want to listen to what you have to say, whether or not they agree with it, but just who will support the effort of writing and storytelling. So thank you all, really, it means the world to me, and just Voces de Santa Fe, I know I'm not on social media, but I'm well aware of Voces de Santa Fe because people often send me screenshots, Facebook postings of lots of things that you all are doing, which is really, really, really valuable. And I will just say one thing in honor of my father, Jaima Chevalier, who's not here today, but you know, he always said to me from the time I was a little girl, if you have a voice at the table and a seat at the table, you better take advantage of it. And he didn't necessarily say that in a way, you know, I want you to grow up and become a writer. He said, you need to show up and represent your community and be, if you have the opportunity to be a voice for your culture and your community, to take advantage of that. So thank you, Dad, for that. In terms of just basics, origin story, I grew up in the Casa Solana neighborhood, part of that post-war generation of families who moved from other heritage spaces in town. My father was raised on East of Vargas Street. My prima still lives there with my aunt. My mother was raised on West Manhattan, in the house that Maria's grandfather built, that my grandfather eventually purchased in 1923. But my parents were part of that generation that eventually moved to the suburbs, if you will, to Casa Solana. And you know, it was opportunity, and it was a different way of life that was being strived for at the time, and it was a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful place to grow up. My mother, who's 102, still lives in the house that I grew up in. Right on. It's an old stamp home, built in 1957. They bought it for an obscenely low amount of money. But it was a wonderful neighborhood to grow up in because there were kids. Everybody had, of course, 6 kids at that time, right? So it was just one of those free-for-all neighborhoods when your parents were not quite as attentive as parents are today because they were busy doing other things. I went to Gonzales Elementary School where I met Michael McGarity, the famous author. At the time, he was a counselor at Gonzales Elementary School, and we've been friends for a lifetime. And thanks for being here, Michael. And then attended BF Young Junior High. That's, junior high no longer exists. And I'm also a proud demon. I went to Santa Fe High. So I'm a public school girl. And I often say that to people, you know, proudly. Public schools get a really bad rap these days, but I have plenty plenty of friends who still send their kids to public schools and who turn out just fine. So, to support our public schools because it's very, very important.
When I was growing up in the same schools, pretty much, a lot of my friends were shy about using the Spanish language and did it kind of on the down low. And so when you were growing up, was there a sense of, here's our treasure of heritage and we want you to be proud of it? Or was it something where it was, kept kind of quiet?
Well, it wasn't quiet because all of my elders spoke Spanish all the time. My parents spoke Spanish to one another, or when they didn't want us to know what they were talking about. All my tias and tios always spoke Spanish among themselves. I am of that generation, like many here, who were not taught Spanish from the outset because it was considered a potential disadvantage at the time. When we talk about these issues, I often say we have to think about them generationally. So though my parents grew up with Spanish as their first language, as they evolved into their professional lives and into more of a, not so much a Nuevo Mexicano life, but more of an American life, they were seeking the advantages that they could give their kids that would not be a detriment, potentially. And they had experiences where having an accent was a detriment, or not knowing perfect English could be a detriment. So they decided to really instill a different sense of language in us, so that it was a good thing for me. I became very proficient in English. I also, though, had the advantage of growing up with all these elders who were speaking Spanish all the time. So I had the sound in my ears, and of course in my DNA. So I had to study Spanish eventually. It wasn't ever a thing like Spanish is a terrible thing, but my mother was a school teacher, a first grade teacher, and she could also see that sometimes if there was not a bilingual classroom, those kids who could not speak English or who had a challenge with it fell behind. So it was a protective mechanism. I will say that both of my parents really regret that they didn't teach us Spanish as a first language, but I've learned it through time. Not amazingly fluent, but.
You mean you don't know all the slang and bad words?
I know the bad words.
That's all I learned.
That's right.
When we look back, through time, we see now your amazing career. I don't think people know the range of Carmella's work. She worked for Wall Street Journal, Albuquerque Tribune, Santa Fe Reporter, the Daily Lobo. You've been around the globe, so to speak, here. Were there key figures in your early schooling that led you to want to become a writer?
I wish I could say, I wanted to be a writer since I was 10 or 5 or whatever. I was not on that track at all. I was always interested in storytelling and reading, and I loved writing book reports and that kind of thing. I never aspired to writing from an early age. But I had my grandfather who died when I was 10, my grandfather, Manuel Khan Sr. I used to spend every Sunday afternoon with him because my mom would go and meet her sisters and they'd dump the kids off with Grandpa and they'd go have coffee at Furs or somewhere. And I used to sit with him. I'd come in and he would always be in a big armchair and with history books around him. And there was a little stool there and he'd have books there for me to read, kids' books, and sometimes the funny papers. And so we would read together. And he would always say to me, learn your history. I mean, I was a little girl. I mean, he died when I was 10, but he instilled that in me from the time I was very, very young. And so I would say he was the primary influence because he didn't say be a writer, but again, it would all fold into that. Learn your history, know who you are, know where you came from. That was very, very important to him. Later in life, as I went to University of New Mexico, was in the journalism program there, and got steered into that program very fortunately by Tony Hillerman, who, of course, everybody knows is an amazing author. And he was teaching a class that I was taking in the English department because I was thinking I had tried a little stint. I was going to be a physical therapist. Don't know why, go figure. But I really am not a science-minded person, so chemistry, biology just was not my thing. So then I thought, okay, well, let me go to the English department because I love to read and write. Maybe I'll go be an academic. And I happened to take a class with Tony, and that he was teaching in that department. And he said, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I think I want to be a writer. And he said, well, okay, if you want to do that, why don't you go to the journalism department? He said, you could do that here, but you're going to be on a literature track, an English lit track, and you might write, you might teach, probably. If you want to work as a writer, you want to learn how to research, you want to learn how to make deadlines, which is really, really important if you're going to publish. Why don't you go try the journalism department? And I did, and he was my professor there for many years, as well as a number of other professors. That journalism program was a really great journalism program. And I landed there, and I knew I was home because it was really about interacting with other people. And it wasn't really about telling my story at first, it was about telling their stories. And I just loved that ability to have a conversation with somebody and then try to distill it into something creative that would say something about them.
Right, but you still have that, forgive the word, scientific ability to look for the hard facts, because, you know, journalism looks to, you know, what actually happened, what actually transpired. And writing sometimes strays into, you know, mythology, and I think that's one of the core things that interests me about New Mexico is we have this huge, you know, bipolar approach to our state's history. One side, the academic is telling us, well, you know, here's the mythology of New Mexico, here's how it happened. And then there's the real people in the kitchens and the barbershops who are actually telling you what transpired, and you're the journalist collecting those facts and putting them back out. I know that's going to play into the conversation is, you know, what about this problem we have now with truthiness, where falsehoods are creeping into journalism locally and nationally, and, you know, is that, how did you approach journalism when you started out, say, working at the Daily Logo?
Well, that program at that time, and I would hope that journalism programs are still like this, but I'm looking at Inez because we share a long journalistic history together. But I mean, they were very rigid about standards. It was all about objectivity, which in itself is a myth, I will say, ultimately, because journalists are probably the most opinionated people I know, and for good reason in many instances. I think, but still, you could be in that cohort, and you could still have people though who were adhering to that rigid idea of balance and objectivity and trying to tell both sides of the story. I didn't come to history by reading all the academic books. I sort of did it backward, I guess, a little bit. My education was from talking to people and learning those stories from around the kitchen table. So, which would often make me say, oh, wow, well, that's interesting because this is the way I always heard it. And, you know, so you start to try to reconcile the popular history that you're learning growing up in your families and whatever with the factual history, which I was obliged to as a journalist, and try to figure out where the two meet. Because there's always, you know, the truth is always in the middle, right? And so in that sense, it was a very rigid training. And I was in that mode as a journalist for many, many years in terms of working at newspapers. And then when I decided I wanted to tell a different kind of a story, but it still involved facts, It was when I thought I would go out and start writing some books, which I thought would be just an easy, gentle transition. I was so naive. But I wanted to do it, and I found the right people who were willing to help guide me in that direction.
Yeah, there's sort of a gap there. We see you as a college student and exploring, you know, your journalism trade, but then suddenly you're catapulted into this realm of a very prodigious writer with a huge range of titles, and that is so fascinating to me too, because some people are very niche, you know, they're focused on one line of study, and your range it goes all over New Mexico. It's kind of like you gave us the universe of a lot of different things about New Mexico through your work.
Well, and that I came through journalism. That was my learning curve. I mean, I started out in journalism at the Trib. The very first gig I had at the Trib was writing obituaries, because there's a craft to that, and that when you were sort of an intern in there, which I was at that time, they assigned you to write obituaries or sports. So I did everything, you know, or chasing ambulances or whatever. But the thing about the obituary writing is that they wanted you to approach it like you were telling the story of a person who might still be living, but you're really celebrating and elevating that person. And that was great training. It was really great training. And then you had to, you know, the next day you had to go cover a golf tournament. I did that. I don't know anything about golf, but you just had to get out there and do it. So you had to learn flexibility, you had to learn multitasking, you had to learn productivity. So you had to really be churning things out. And I will say that after a certain point, I got really tired of the daily journalism grind, and even the weekly journalism grind. And I have the highest praise for the people who are still doing it, because for me it became a little formulaic in the way that I was seeing my writing evolve. And so I decided, well, could I evolve it into a different area? And the learning curve of going through New Mexico and all this subject matter was a learning curve of reporting and figuring out how something I was reporting might have related to my experience. And that was really my education into my own history. I grew up in Santa Fe in a very rich, culturally rich, loving family with lots of experiences, but I was not a kid that was pulled to museums all the time. I was not a kid even though my grandfather said, learn your history, he didn't sit there and tell me my history. I mean, it was sort of just your daily experience of life that you weren't really absorbing. And so it took me, first of all, saying I was not ever going to come back to Santa Fe, because you're at a certain age you say, oh, I grew up here, I'm going to go off to bigger things. And I had been in Dallas working at a major newspaper there for a while, and I thought I wanted to go out into the world. And then I just sort of started getting pulled back and had influences that were saying, come work here. There was a family friend who was a priest, a Franciscan priest named Miguel Baca, who some of you may know, who was a longtime friend of my family's, my father growing up, Rick's family. And he said to me, he was a really intellectual Franciscan priest, one of the probably most well-read people I ever knew. And he said, why don't you come back from Texas and start telling our stories instead of telling all these other people's stories, and giving our storytelling an insider's point of view. And that was at a period that Santa Fe was getting a lot more play in the national media. And so you had the national media sort of converging on Santa Fe and telling the story of who we are to the world. And it wasn't always accurate, right? Because you can't just dive into a place and dive out, and certainly not in a place like this. So if I didn't know it yet, a lot of folks didn't know it. So it became part of my learning and my education to sort of start going into these areas of reporting and learning more about my own culture and even my own family. You know, we take it for granted that we have this amazing close-knit community here. Somebody was just saying, oh my God, everybody knows everybody here. Harry was just saying, when he first came to Santa Fe, it was like, it was really weird because you know everybody when you walk in the room if you've been here long enough. And it really, knowing those people, but also really knowing the story doesn't always get communicated right off the bat.
Well, I think it's kind of great that you weren't schooled on what New Mexico history is and you didn't go to museums, because you bring a freshness to the material that, you know, for someone who doesn't, like, if I don't know Rancho de las Golondrinas, you give me that excitement of the fresh newness of discovering it. And we've talked about how people move here and they say, oh, I discovered Santa Fe. Let me tell you all about it. and you talked about that. We need an outsider perspective, but we need to tap into the insider perspective. When I went to UNM, I read 4 Centuries of New Mexico History by Warren Beck. It had 1 paragraph on Popeye. That's it. 1 paragraph on the Pueblo Revolt. And we need our own voices to come in and say, wait a minute, we need to flesh this out. You gave us the bare bones, but there's so much more to it. And that's why I like this quote from, you did a book called Conexiones, and I love the dedication that you wrote at the beginning, because it kind of dovetails with what the Voces mission is, telling our own history in our own voices. And that your dedication, I'll just read it, it kind of reflects that. You dedicated the book to all the artists and everyday people whose lives, hearts, and imaginations converge here. And I don't know, you know, if your readers have ever come up to you and said, oh, I feel seen, or I feel heard, because you actually wrote about something that maybe no one's ever written a book about low riders. I mean, now they're copying you, but you were the first, right?
Well, we were early on.
Early on.
And I say I've got to give credit to Jack Parsons, who's an incredible photographer, one of my dearest friends, who I worked with on at least 3 books, and I'm working with him on a project right now. But he brought the visual aspect into the Chile Chronicles, Slow and Slow. But at that point, it was interesting. When the Chile Chronicles came out in 1996, I think, and I started that book in 1990, it really was this spark of recognition that the ritual that I shared at my dinner table regularly of my father, you know, judging whether the chili was good enough or if it was weeds, as he used to call it. You know, and if good enough meant it was hot enough and it was flavorful. And there was this whole ritual around that. My mother didn't eat chili, but she made really, or much chili, but really made great chili. And I was observing this ritual and thinking, well, what is it about this one plant, which was identified with New Mexico, but not at the scale that it is now? And how does it interweave with the social history of our communities and our daily experience? And so that's the way I tend to approach things, is looking at maybe something like a chili or a piece of art, but trying then to put that convergence of individuals around it into telling that story, because people's stories are ultimately the driver and really interesting. And in the Conexiones book, it really was about not only Hispano people who had created beautiful artworks over centuries and created a devotional tradition that is truly our own, but it was also about communities of people who did come from elsewhere, who noticed something about it and validated it in a way that we could say we didn't need it validated, because we validated it in our homes and our churches every day, but validated it from a different perspective to say that, you know, this is so valuable, it should be preserved. Now, there's a lot of good and bad that comes with all of that, right? I tend to sort of always try to take the middle ground when I can. You know, New Mexico.
Red is better, sorry. Red is better.
I agree. I'm a red girl.
No middle ground, sorry.
No, but in terms of just talking about the convergence of cultures that has happened here over time, nothing is black and white. And nothing is, there's so much nuance and so many layers, and even in our own communities and even in our own families. And so it's really impossible to make very definitive statements about it's just this, because we all know it's not. And so we fight that sometimes, but I try to find that point of convergence in the work. And I also make it a point to, when there are facts or mythologies being repeated, which I have repeated myself, because I grew up, absorbing a lot of mythologies about our culture and about our experience. And so in my early years, maybe I repeated them. Now I go back and I'm a lot more tempered about it because I know more. And I say, okay, let's think about this. Our voice is really important, and I'm not saying that it's not. I mean, the Voces de Santa Fe, that whether you're from whatever culture you come from, they're so critical to be really maintaining the authenticity of this place, and authenticity is an overused word now. That is so important. But we're not the only voice, and I think we're a much more fascinating community because of the convergence of perspectives and experiences. Now, with that, if it's not us telling every story ourselves, you're going to get stories that are told in different ways, which sometimes it's wonderful and sometimes it's not. And my rule of thumb is usually, it's a privilege for any of us to be here telling stories, or just still being in the homes in the city where generations of our family grew up. It's a privilege, and I consider my work and the work that I do a privilege to be able to do that. And by the same token, it's a privilege for others to come in and share that space. And my sort of judging point is usually, if you want to take responsibility and have respect and have time to really pay attention and learn and include the voices of this community, then I'll want to read your book as well. That's important. So I think we're a richer community by having a more expansive point of view.
Well, kind of another metaphor for your writing. You don't stay in one lane. You go off in all these directions. So it's kind of like, Carmella doesn't have a through thread. She has a giant web. She covers the universe of New Mexico. It feels like to me that you do pull from all these strengths of storytelling. And but I wanted to go back just to finish out your personal story. We have another Titan here, your husband.
Oh, God.
Luis Savia.
Oh, don't call him a Titan.
He's a Titan. And I know that, like, the devil, no. But see, that's what I'd love to hear about, because, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that you've taken more of a social justice advocate perspective, and you may be just as much an advocate, but in quieter analytical writing ways. Do you guys ever have any friction, or do you have any like, has she ever stolen an idea of yours, Mr. Tapia?
You'd have to ask her.
Okay, have you ever coached on his turf, or has his visual understanding of the universe ever informed your writing?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Could you give us an example?
Well, absolutely. I mean, okay, true confession. I met Luis interviewing him for a book. So I came to know him through his art, and I came to a greater understanding of the art and the history of the art and the evolution of the art through his work. So we had that common ground already, and we actually, both of our worlds tend to intersect a lot. When I was doing the Lowrider book, I'm not a car girl. I don't even change a flat tire. I'm serious. And so I was like, oh, I need to know about the mechanics of these cars. I can't just tell the stories, I really need to understand. So I would ask him lots of questions, or I'd go sit in garages with guys in Española on Sunday afternoon, and sometimes, or Chimayo or whatever, and Luis would take me. And so I often mine his experience and his knowledge. He's a furniture maker, an artist, I mean, and I've written about all of those things, so we often talk about that. And we often talk about the evolution of our community and our culture, and we often disagree on certain things. We might have a different approach, but we are both independent artists, have great respect for each other's work and way of working, and I guess the best thing is that we allow each other the space to work the way that we do, because we have very different work styles. But
your output is just amazing. I know you're working on two things now, but just looking back to the pieces that I knew, do you have any spare time? I mean, my God, the amount of, I think some of the other famous authors here in the audience, there's a couple very prodigious people here, but it's a lot of work, and is it the work, tell us about your workload, your typical work day.
Well, it has shifted through the years. It used to be just we're all writing all day and research, and I could sit in the work for 8, 10, and 12 hours a day when I was cranking out those books a lot of times. I'm not that fast anymore, and I also, my time is more scattered. I've always really, I help take care of my mother first and foremost, so I have that aspect. Try to have time for my husband. Also feel very obligated to serve the community where I can. Again, going back to that thing, if you have a seat at the table and you can help. And so I've worked in a lot of nonprofit organizations in Santa Fe over time, since I was in my early 20s, since I first came back to Santa Fe. And so some people have said to me, if you didn't do that, you could have so many more books. But that makes my life a lot richer. So, I don't have a lot of spare time, and I wish I had more time right now actually to devote to my writing, and I need to do that and start saying, okay, I need to get back to that full-time focus. But I couldn't do that 10, 12 hours a day.
Oh, it's grueling. I don't know if we mentioned, but Carmella is a recipient of the Governor's Award for Excellence in the Arts and the Mayor's Award, and also co-founder of the Santa Fe Literary Festival, which is a huge way of giving back to the community. I know it's touched probably all of us here in this room, the fact that Santa Fe's on the map, so to speak. We're part of this literary renaissance, and it's a huge debt of gratitude, from us. But all those fantastic achievements aside, is there some personal highlight of your career, like some reward, maybe an intangible one that really, somebody came up to you and said you changed their life, or something besides all the laudatory, wonderful honors?
Well, just anybody that says I've read a piece of your work. I always joke that with a lot of these wonderful coffee table books, everybody just looks at the pictures because Jack's such a great photographer, right? Do they read the words, right? So I know, especially now in our era of information overload, it's harder to find time to read. So anytime anybody says they've read anything, I really am appreciative, or people come in and want to just share experiences. That's really important to me. A highlight, it's all been really a highlight. I'll tell you a funny story. My first book, which was the one that was given away, which I might write it in a different way now, so just keep that in mind when you're reading it. That came out, I think, in '96, and one day I was at the post office with my dad, like 3-4 years into the book being published, and I pulled out a piece of mail, and it was a royalty check.
A rarity.
I had no idea what it was. I was like, why do they sending me $96? And for the Department of Cultural Affairs, I had zero idea. And then I went and read it a little bit more. I said, Dad, it's a royalty check.
You should frame it, you should frame it.
Yeah, I have no idea where it is. But the point being, I never really anticipated that would be any kind of reward. Because if you don't get into books or writing because you think you're going to, I mean, you've got to be very lucky and very talented to do that. I mean, your first motivation has to be telling the story and honing your craft, I think. And I feel like that's still something I struggle toward and am challenged by. I try to be a better writer with everything I do, and I don't feel I'm there yet, but maybe we'll get there with the next one or another.
You're there.
One other thing, we talked about, being careful in the journalism craft and the writing craft to try to find the truth and stick to that. And sometimes writers find themselves in a position where they have to be kind of an indirect advocate for something. I wonder if you could share the story about what you found in Colorado when you were working on the Bowman Santos book, that's kind of the repatriation, that even though you were just there, quote unquote, on research or what have you, you actually did something that righted a wrong.
So my latest book with printer Tom Leach is a book called Gustav Baumann, Printing the Spirit, Gustav Baumann's Santos. And it's a story of the artist Gustav Baumann, who we all know as a really wonderful printmaker who lived in Santa Fe from 1918 till he died in 1971, and really was one of those people that elevated Santa Fe as an art center in a really positive way, and he also contributed to the community in an amazing way. But in his travels and creating this book, because it was a book that he wanted to publish, didn't get published in his lifetime. We published it for him now just recently. He was documenting Santos so that, because he was concerned that they were leaving the communities too quickly. It was a time, early 20s, Santa Fe was being discovered, and the art of Santo making was suddenly being elevated by collectors, and people were purchasing them out of churches and out of moradas and such, oftentimes willingly sold by the communities for various reasons. And so we tracked down some of the Santos that he used as models for his woodblock prints, and I found one in the actual Santo in Colorado Springs at the museum there, and found others here in Santa Fe in museums. But that story, that particular Santo was an image of Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception, and it had been purchased by Mary Austin, who was a famous early 20th century author who lived in Santa Fe for a time, out of the Morada at Abiquiu. And it was purchased, and the thing about Baumann is he documented everything and he told these stories, and so he told his own story of being on that trip where she purchased it, and making his own distinction that he didn't feel that that those things should be valued in a sales way, that you shouldn't be able to purchase these things out of a morada or a church. And so finding it and making that connection, and then actually writing about it, and I was telling her that I might have been manipulating the text a little bit, just telling the story in his words, saying, you know, if everything is right one day, this piece might make it back to its community one day. Meaning he could foresee a time in the future that piece needed to go back to its community. It's not there at the moment. It's still in the museum, being cared for in a beautiful way. But it had all the paperwork that had come from Mary Austin's collections, the exact same image, so we know it's that. So I was just, in the terms of telling the story, I emphasized that a little bit, thinking, well, maybe there's going to be an enlightened director one of these days who might say, oh, maybe we should think about seeing whether these folks in Abiquiu want this Santo back. There are many images of that same saint that are very similar, actually in that museum collection. So it's not like you'd be taking the only image that they have. They actually have duplicates of it in that collection. So anyway, we were just talking about that, and can you use your writing to try to correct history, maybe correct heal the wrongs, or heal the feelings of communities now that feel that they were wronged. But in that story, like everything else, it's not black and white. That community participated in selling the santos to people for good reason. Often you needed a roof on the morada, you needed and that's what was in that documentation. But it's very complicated, and so I think that I try to remember nothing is black and white. We've got to consider the context and try to create understanding. You don't have to create agreement, but create understanding if possible.
It's so difficult. I one time had a visitor from Japan, and we happened to stumble upon a Matashini's dance, and he asked me, well, what does this mean? And I was just devastated, because I realized, how do you explain like 4,000 years of history from first contact with Hernan Cortez all the way to Chimayo or whatever? I wasn't even capable of doing it. So I gave him some mealy-mouthed version of it. But maybe the last thing we could hear from you would be, what advice could you give to, because all of these people here, they're not amateur historians, they're like, living historians, they're orators of our story. How can we tell our story? What are ways to get out those complicated facts about weirdness that is New Mexico?
Well, just dialogue, talking about it, talking through things, because I think that will help you come to an understanding of your own family. Writing it down, not everybody's a writer, and you don't have to think you're writing for publication, but to write it down just so that it's remembered. And maybe somebody is going to take that memory one day and write it down for you in a published way. But the questions that you have about your own communities or your history or whatever, start asking them to the people who you know. I started recently asking an uncle about something that I came upon while writing about Bauman, and it was a whole episode around the Bursum Bill, which was a bill that was in 1923 introduced to, there was a movement to have people who had been living on Indian lands for over 10 years to just be able to occupy the Indian lands. And that goes back to a history of shared communities, where oftentimes there was a Spanish village right next to an Indian village. My mother was born at San Ildefonso, not San Ildefonso Pueblo, but in the Spanish village of San Ildefonso, okay? She moved to town in 1923. They decided to come to Santa Fe. She was 3 years old. 1926. She was 3 years old. That was right around the time the Bursum Bill thing was happening. And I was thinking, was my family part of that group that was considered squatters on Indian land? And I was horrified to think, oh my God, but by the same token, I was like, wow, that's really interesting. Is that a possibility? So I've started to talk to my 93-year-old uncle a little bit about it. He's a bit of the family historian, and we don't know, and it could maybe not be, and maybe it could be, but part of the story is also that they had a very close relationship with the people of San Ildefonso. My great aunt knew Maria the Potter. They were neighbors, they were friends, so all of those stories that, again, you look to as being sort of cut and dry, might touch your own family in a way that'll give you insights to your history, and maybe it's not all as palatable as we'd like it to be, but I think it's really important for you to ask the questions, and if there are things that are in your mind that you really want to get to the bottom to start to explore it a little bit. This organization, Voces, is really a great resource. I mean, the photos you print, the stories you tell and share are really amazing. And that's part of history, of gathering history. So I would just encourage you all to not necessarily go out and try to be a writer if that's not your thing, but to at least don't be shy about asking the stories and claiming your space. Like knowing that your story is worth telling and sharing.
Well, it's a wonderful stopping point because we thought we'd save some time for Q&A. If people do have questions, we can take that mic around. If you see anyone raise their hand, you can. I just wanted to give, real quick, I just want to give Carmella a little gift. It's very personal to me because of my little story at the beginning, that I was lucky enough to meet her in the shop where we did stuff with Milagros. So I wanted her to. And here's the box.
Beautiful. You made this?
Yeah, Connie taught me. We spent hours gluing Milagros or nailing them to little crosses.
That's great.
Okay, hopefully, I saw one question.
Yeah.
You want to catch one? Want me to?
Thank you. Your words were just so beautiful and inspiring. I'm just curious, what sparked your interest in the lowrider phenomenon?
Thank you, Demetria. Demetria, if you don't know, is also just an accomplished Dominicana writer, poet, wonderful part of our community, dear friend. Actually, it was Jack Parsons. We had done the Chile Chronicles together, and he had gone to a car show, and he said, hey, let's do a magazine article on these cars, and he had a few photographs of lowriders, and we did a magazine article, and then we had so much fun hanging out with all these artists who were transforming their cars, and we decided to pitch it as a book, and it really, it's actually the only book I've ever done that's been reprinted. It's out of print now, but it's been reprinted. It was reprinted more than once because it was a universal subject, you know. And at that point, that was in '98, I think. Lowriders were just sort of starting to come into their own as an art form. Oftentimes, they were dismissed as, you know, the purview of gangbangers and druggies and trouble. And that was part of our mission in doing that project, was to validate that art form. Yes?
Saints and sinners.
Saints and sinners, yes. Yeah.
Oh.
Can't see that.
I just want to share back some of the beautiful words you said and how they were meaningful to me. And it's going to end in a question for the whole room. So this is my first time attending one of these functions where we spoke about the importance of finding your voice, sharing your voice, being at the table, being a voice at the table. We've talked a lot about storytelling, we've talked a lot about writing. But for me, what really came up when you talked about your father trying to decide if it was weeds or good chili, what was so astonishing for me was you also said that you were 6 kids running wild in the neighborhood, and those of us of a certain age were all feral as children, right? It was a wonderful thing. And you say your parents were busy doing other things, but your father was at the kitchen table. You had meal times together. And I'm having chills, and I almost want to cry over the notion that that's not an ordinary thing anymore. Your father was there. Your mother, who didn't even like chili, showed up to cook that chili for your dad and the family. And your father, who was very busy and a big family to support, he showed up at that table so that you could witness that. And then you wrote a book about it. So what came up for me that's very beautiful and meaningful about some of the things you said is that, yeah, storytelling and writing is important, but just being there for the young people becomes their story, right?
Yeah, and I think that many of us grew up in this community in very multi-generational settings, which is invaluable, because I'm not sure that happens so much even anymore. And I even see that with some of my own family. You know, I don't interact with the younger ones as much as I was with my tias and tios all the time, my grandfather, you know, all the time. It was just part of your fabric, and whether you wanted to be in that setting or not, you were still absorbing something that was really, really important, and that leads to bonds, you know, that now really nourish my life. So I think you're right. This family in this culture is everything, and I know in most cultures it's everything. In this way, in this community, it's really, really vital to who we are.
Thank you. So here's the question. I'm very embarrassed of having a senior moment. I cannot remember the gentleman's name. But in 1988, I was a teacher at Alameda Junior High, which no longer exists. And there was one gentleman there, a teacher, who showed up to work, who showed up to school to be in his classroom at 5 a.m. every day. Why? He had this whole setup. It was his wood carving studio, and he was it was part of his family that was passed down, that he was the traditional maker of the wooden santos. And I'm blanking on the gentleman's names. And it was so, he didn't lecture the kids about woodworking or telling the story of the saints and why he made them or what they meant. But he was there, the kids he created this atmosphere that the children walked into every morning. And I think that, David Gonzalez, thank you,
And Dave was my language arts teacher.
My daughter was also a student at Tony and she went to UNN, God bless her. Berkeley came calling and put her in the journalism school all over the country. They wanted her, so she ended up at the Houston Chronicle. She's about your age. But I wanted to just make a statement to the power of story. She wrote a story about me being a child bride at 14. And people were like, oh my God, people in an arranged wedding. From her story, Texas went, oh my God, we can't have that. They changed the law. You have to be 18 in the state of Texas to get married. I am currently trying to get that law passed in New Mexico, that we not give our children, girl children, away. So I'm on Facebook. I'm going to be asking everybody to support New Mexicans against child marriage. Thank you.
I am curious to know how the legend of La Llorona may or may not have influenced your childhood.
Well, mostly just, you know, I grew up in Casa Solana, just cross Alameda, and there's the river. So it was she was the source of, you know, a lot of sleep out, scary night stories for sure. But I never ventured into the river to try to find her. But she definitely was part of it.
Thank you for that.
hope it's okay to ask you this since you didn't mention it, but I think a lot of people would be interested in knowing who your grandpa was. You mentioned your grandfather, Pond, who had this influence on you to know your history.
Right.
I think people would like to know who he is because he was a voice, not just in our community, but in our country.
Well, I shouldn't have left out my grandmother also, but I had one grandparent who I knew. The others had all died by the time I was born. So my grandfather was, his name was Manuel Lujan Sr. My grandmother was Lorencita Romero Lujan. She was an elected county clerk, so she was a strong, politically oriented woman. My grandfather was mayor of Santa Fe for most of the 1940s. Very, old school Republican, New Mexican Republican, and that was part of it. Really instilled a sense of civic duty and participation in me, and had a lot of influence. My uncle then went on to be a congressman and a secretary of Interior out of that family. So a lot. I'm not super political, which is probably because I grew up in a political family, but it was also a different time, and a really a better time, right?
Yeah, I have a question. I perceive that in this room there are a lot of people who have written books and a lot of wannabe artists, wannabe authors with stories to tell. If a person doesn't have a story to tell, I'm asking for a friend. What are the steps that person should take to get that story out? I'm not a particularly good skilled at writing a book or anything like that, but I do have a story to tell. And I just want to know what you were saying, something about writing these things down. I have a lot written down already, but what is the next step? How do you find somebody to write that story for you?
Well, if you want to be published in a professional publication, you've got to go through a bunch of hoops, right? I really regret that La Herencia doesn't exist any longer, which Pacheco created, because that was really a forum for locals to tell their stories, and you didn't have to be a professional writer to do it. You could just tell your memories and such. I mean, I see Voces, this Facebook interaction, as an opportunity to do that, whether or not you all have opportunities to do longer form, publish longer form things on that Facebook page or not. If you want to be put through your paces a little bit and work with an editor, you can always hit one of the local publications up to see if they would pitch them a story and see if they would be willing to publish or have somebody work with you on that. It is a lot of hoops to go through to get things out in the bigger way professionally, but I think there's still a lot of forms, and actually with online presence, there's much more opportunity than ever than when I was growing up, for sure. So I would just, and there are also people who write, who you can hire to help you write your story. Good luck, thank you.
We have time for one more.
Yeah. Oh,
Right?
Oh,
no, that's okay. Monday.
Carmella, I was thinking about your father, Reyes. He grew up pretty much about 300 feet from my dad, who lived on the first block of Laura Canyon Road. But your dad, ever since I was a little kid, he was this tall, handsome man, and he always remembered my name. I remember he was fought in World War II as a Marine in Guadalcanal, and then your mom, one time I went by her home to visit her, and she knew my name also. I was like, wow, what memories they have, What did you do? That's the question. And then, who case of beer that Manuel was gonna win the next election, and he never lost. You know, he was our congressman for many years, and then they, you know, added a district. But you know, he was also a very nice man, you know. And I wanted to ask you, we were talking one day about how the new Guadalupe church was built. I think it had to do with your family, right?
Yes.
Can you tell us that story?
Before I was born, when my grandmother died, it was only the Santuario de Guadalupe was still standing. And they had outgrown the church. There was a funeral and not everybody could get in. And they had outgrown the church, and they decided that it was time to build a new church. And there was a discussion about raising the old church, like tearing it down, the Santuario, which is such a treasure, in order to build the new church. And that didn't happen, partly because of family influence, and they didn't feel like that piece of history should go. My grandfather was a dear friend of John Galmin, who was a proponent of historic preservation. They worked together on many things that had to do with preserving historic structures in Santa Fe. One of them was the Santuario. But anyway, that was the sort of the impetus for building a bigger church. And now they both sit side by side. And the Santuario de Guadalupe is still my favorite church in